Amen. It is great to be back in the first of our now monthly theology town halls that we'll host this fall. And it's great to have as a special guest my friend, my almost colleague, but now colleague, Dr. Dennis Edwards. I was first introduced to Dennis by friends in the field of biblical studies and knew immediately that we were friends because we had mutual friends. And then I almost got to come be the dean of the school where he was teaching, St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute. But at that very moment, he answered a pastoral call to serve a congregation in Minneapolis. He has now ended up at another institution where I used to teach. But we have lured him back to St. Mary's in multiple ways. We've had him come and present at our Alumni Day. But even more importantly, he's agreed to join the faculty of our Doctor of Ministry program. And so in addition to occasionally guesting in reading scripture, which he'll do this fall again with Dr. Gorman, he and Dr. Rebecca Eklund are the co-teachers of embodying scripture. And one of the reasons that I love Dr. Edwards is because I believe he is a person who helps us know how to faithfully embody scripture. His new book, Might from the Margins, came to my attention because his Facebook page helped me, no, Mike Gorman's Facebook page helped me to notice that Christianity Today had done a kind of preview of it in a great article called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And that, I think, came out this summer. This is a powerful read, and I wanted us to talk with Dr. Edwards about the message that this book contains. And without further ado, Dr. Dennis Edwards, welcome home to St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute. Let's hear from you.
Wow, it really is a privilege to be with you. I tell everybody how special a place the EI is, and really was honored to teach there. And I actually was on that search committee that called Dean Latham. And as he was coming, I was leaving to go to Minnesota. But I appreciate staying connected. Right before I get into the material, I should say that one of the places where I got to talk about this before it was a book was at the EI, because at that alumni gathering, I gave a talk that related to one of the chapters in here. So some of you may hear a little bit of that resonance there, because it was my work in the book of First Peter. I have a small commentary on First Peter that prompted my thinking on these topics. I'm also going to say, by way of preface, that I purposefully in the book center non-majority culture folks, and a lot of times writings from people, even from ethnic minorities and from women, somehow seems still to be addressed to the dominant part of our culture, white males, almost as if to say, please hear us, this is what we have to say, or please change, or something to that effect. And I was trying to not do that, but I feel like in some sense it maybe does still. But you'll see what I mean as I get started here. I will share my screen, and I have a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation that hopefully will come through clearly. Let's see. All right, let's see. Can you see? All right, okay, good. All right, so some of you may have seen Black Panther, and if you haven't, you should, for a variety of reasons. But there's a powerful scene in there. There's a lot of powerful scenes, but one particular scene that struck me was when King T'Challa was incapacitated. His mother, sister, agent from Wakanda, played by Lupita Nyong'o, and a white CIA agent all came to get help from the Jabari tribe. And they speak here to M'Baku, who is the leader of the tribe. And as soon as they come to make their case, Agent Ross, the white agent from the CIA, starts to speak, and he starts to explain things. And M'Baku barks and starts to pound his staff. And he does it so that finally Agent Ross shuts up. And I wanted to stand up in the movie theater and shout and cheer, because that was like something I wish could have happened in my life. There were so many times when white men felt like they could just, without any prompting or any reasoning that we could see, felt that they could speak for everybody and explain things. And here's the folks from Wakanda with their needs, and somebody else is speaking for them. So I want to make the point in the book that our voices matter, which is what I mean by might from the margins. And that seems like a rather innocuous thing to say, but so did Black Lives Matter. I thought was a rather innocuous thing to say until I see all the backlash. But I'll go into a few themes from the book. It's centered around this idea that Paul writes to the church in Corinth that is made of people from the social elite as well as folks from the margins. And he talks about his own speaking ability as well as his own presence. And he says, consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. And we read that and maybe perhaps move from it quickly, but that's a powerful notion that carries through much of the New Testament. These are the table of contents of the book, but I'm not going to talk about all of this, but I just wanted you to know that I try to deal with different notions that come up in the scriptures and in our interactions as Christians. And I put this together based on my years of pastoral experience. I mean, I've been a pastor for altogether about 30 years, and I taught adjunct at this for much of that time, taught New Testament. It's grace of God. I'm happy to be able to teach full time now. But my pastoral experience helped me to see some issues that were emerging. And I'll also say that as much as I have been at work in trying to bridge the gap between African Americans and white culture or whatever group. I'm from New York originally, so we think in terms of a broad collection of people. And I saw myself as a bridge builder, but I realized that the models that people were holding up were models of proximity and not of power. In other words, we were happy if we could get everybody in the same room, but we weren't talking about how then decisions get made. It's like the Agent Rosses of the world speaking up for everybody else. So these are the chapters in the book, but I'm not going to talk about all of this, but I will highlight a few things. First, I talk about what I call the power of diaspora people, and this was part of what I had presented back in at the EI a couple of years ago. So Peter writes to a community. He says, apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen ones who are living as strangers in the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. And then he goes on later to say, beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. Peter is directing his letter to people who maybe even not literally are marginalized because of their geographic situation, but because of their faith. But that's a bit debated in Peter's studies. But the point is, they are acting, or rather, they are being treated as aliens and strangers, as people who are separated from the dominant culture. And he's actually asking them to embrace that identity. I urge you as alien strangers to embrace this identity, because it's in this identity that they will communicate what Jesus is like to the dominant society. That's critical to my point. It's that marginalized status that actually communicates the way of Jesus to the dominant culture. Okay, okay, there we go. So I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button here. So from 1 Peter, I'm saying that diaspora Christians, those who are alienated and vulnerable, best exemplify the Jesus way. On the way there, I'm saying that diaspora means vulnerable. It means being alienated. And I have this awesome quote from Willie Jennings. I I understand that Dean Latham went to school with Dr. Jennings, right? Uh, it's actually, he has a wonderful commentary in Acts. Some of you may have been exposed to it already. He's an awesome writer. I won't get all the quote, but I want to just highlight a few things. At the beginning, he says, diaspora means scattering and fragmentation, exile and loss. That's consistent with what we see in 1 Peter, even though he's writing a commentary on Acts. He goes on to say, danger and threat surround diaspora life. The peoples who inhabit diaspora live with animus and violence filling the air they breathe. They live always on the verge of being classified enemy, always in evaluation of their productivity to the empire, always having an acceptance on loan, ready to be taken away at the first sign of sedition. They live with fear as an ever-present partner in their lives, the fear of being turned into a them, a dangerous other, those people among us. This notion of being a diaspora person or person who's alienated means vulnerability and alienation. I could say a lot about it, but one quick example was the way that some Christian publications, and largely in the evangelical world, were targeted toward white Europeans. I mean, there used to be an ad in Christianity Today for you to find your family crest. I have this name Edwards. I have no idea how we got this name Edwards. I could imagine, but I don't know. I can't trace my roots to Europe, at least not directly. And yet they knew their market, and they knew that there would be white evangelicals or of European descent who would want this. But that's an assumption. It's an assumption that was geared to the dominant culture. And so I become very much aware of my diaspora status. I'm not an African. I'm an African American. But we have to name the whole continent because we don't know where we're from. Unlike people who can say they're, Irish American or Norwegian American or something. So we are a diaspora people. And we have experienced this alienation and vulnerability. We're not the only ones, but we serve as a pretty good example. But I'm saying that it's from that vulnerable and alienated position that we can exemplify the Jesus way. And when I say the Jesus way, I mean the way of love, of peacemaking, of community building, and not giving in to the dominant culture. Another great quote, but I won't read it all, but Howard Thurman says, I can count, in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which is a classic, and I hope you've been exposed to it. But he says, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times that I've heard a sermon on the meaning of religion, of Christianity, to the man with his back against the wall. That's the way he refers to people who are marginalized, as he says, disinherited, dispossessed. He wants to know, what does Christianity have to say to that person? And that was also a theme for me. So I talked about the power of diaspora people, but there's a power of marginalized people to discern injustice, to see it from the bottom. And that's something that has been demonstrated in our society. The experts call it standpoint theory. It's understanding the workings of a system of oppression. A perspective from the bottom up is more likely to be accurate than one from the top down. And this is where I probably get a lot of the arguments, because there are a lot of white folks who will say to me, and particularly Christians, who will explain to me, like Agent Ross to M'Baku, what the situation really is. But the experts are saying, the people who have the best view of what the situation is like, especially a system of oppression, are the ones who are actually being oppressed. So what I've noticed is that in the Christian world, there is often a fragility among some white Christians, which you've seen perhaps the book of White Fragility. I talk about a white Christian fragility. It's this difficulty, or this maybe even an inability, that to confront the unjust systems and tend to reduce injustice to a personal issue of kindness or friendliness or such. So this happens a lot. If you use the R word, racism, people get upset and talk about like a personal interaction. This happens among white folks. This happens among evangelicals, particularly because of the way they frame salvation and faith. So it turns out that you can't talk about a systematic oppression of people, because in their mind, they're thinking, it seems like they're thinking, it's just my personal interactions with another person. And if I'm kind and I'm nice, that's all that matters, and missing some of the bigger issues. So people on the bottom can discern injustice. Just a couple more. I also talk in a chapter that I've been getting a lot of feedback about, and mostly good. I call it the power of anger. It's been, I'm one of those people. I'm a pretty easygoing guy. You know, I have grace of God, have good education, and I have often found myself invited into white spaces to speak and such. And then people are surprised when I say things that didn't resonate with their assumptions about me. And so it's easy to dismiss me as angry. And I admit, you know, I'm like, I'm sorry to keep talking Marvel superheroes, but I'm like Bruce Banner. You know, he says in one of the episodes, he tells Captain America how he can turn into the Hulk. He says, I'm always angry, he says. And I think I'm laughing, but there's some truth to that, that there's always this frustration and anger. And I know anger is a secondary emotion, but it's based on the way society has treated us. And then also how I can be dismissed even now. If I say something that doesn't resonate with some people, they'll say, well, he's angry, as if to say, I don't have to listen anymore. But I make a case that anger can be good. I won't go through all the exegesis here, but I try to in the chapter. I talk about how Jesus got angry. And the language is angry and indignant. That's the language that Mark uses in a couple of situations where Jesus is going against the religious establishment in Mark 3, and then with his own disciples in chapter 10, when they want to stop the children from coming to him. And it says he was indignant and insisted that the children come to him. The Apostle Paul got angry at maltreatment when he and Silas were beaten and thrown in prison. And he demanded that the magistrates apologize. He said, we're Roman citizens. Now, Paul had privilege as a citizen, and he stood up for his rights, something I've also heard some Christians say we don't need to do, or we shouldn't have to do, or we're not supposed to do. In terms of standing up for rights, but he did, and he asserted his rights as a Roman citizen. So I want to say that the anger of marginalized people signals the presence of injustice that can lead to something positive, to the dismantling of evil systems. So I discuss that in the book as well. Just a couple last things. I have my final chapters, you know, the power of love, and it's always helpful to think about where do we go from seeing a problem to a solution. But I don't want to be facile about it. There's nothing easy about solutions. And sometimes I feel a pressure that I have to say things in a way that white people will feel at the end of it, oh, well, he was angry, that's okay, but everything's all right now. I can't take on that role all the time. I really think we're in some crisis mode in our society and have been for centuries. So I urge for people on the margins to grow in love with our non-white and non-dominant culture selves, because it's easy to find yourself, you know, hating your own self and who God made you. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but it was hard for me as a young guy getting bused to a white neighborhood to feel good about my Blackness. And in the 70s, when we had Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, we needed it. We needed it. All right. I also encourage us to foster solidarity among marginalized people, because a divide and conquer strategy is prevalent at times. You'll see sometimes the so-called, like the myth of the model minority. You'll see sometimes minority groups pitted against each other, and I'm encouraging a solidarity that's born out of love. And then I ask us to raise our voices without apologizing. Even though I've kind of apologized today for who I am and what I've done, I still try to encourage people to not do that, to simply say who they are and come from their position. And we should be able to receive from folks who seeing things from a different vantage point. I also encourage us to exercise some imagination and creativity. My last slide are a few questions that I think people could think about, but I also want to hear from you. But I asked, you know, what are the contexts and the situations where non-white people or other marginalized people have authority in your life? I don't just mean presence, but I mean authority, intellectual, economic, ethical, moral, spiritual. And you can think of the situations, right? A pastor, perhaps for the ethical, moral, spiritual examples, somebody who's a mentor for you, somebody who actually teaches you. It was a long time before I had anybody who wasn't white be a theological instructor for me. And even as I say that, I'm actually trying to think in my mind, I can't imagine who that is right now, because I can't think of anybody who did that in the formal setting, in the school setting. is being marginalized the same as being outnumbered? I had somebody balk at my presentation one time and said, well, you know, you're only 13% of the population. Of course you can be marginalized. Marginalization is not the same as being outnumbered. So I would ask you to think about that. And how do you think people get marginalized? I mean, did they do something to deserve their marginalization? This was an argument in Christianity for a long time, right? Curse of Ham and all that stuff, that somehow God put us in this situation, or people are marginalized because they opt not to raise their voices, or they opt not to work hard, or whatever it is. Does scripture teach or affirm social hierarchies? And if not, does scripture encourage the dismantling of those hierarchies? Some people say, well, we just have to live with it. This is the way it is. So I would ask you to think about those things. So I gave you a lot of stuff, and I tried to stick within my 20 or so minutes here. And but I am excited to engage in however you want. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what questions may have emerged. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we all thank you, and everybody's probably regretting that we said only 20 minutes, because I'm sure folks would have loved to hear a 30-minute presentation. I'm struck by so much that's in your book. We had our Intro to Theology class read a section of it last week, and I was
Wow.
we read your discussion of the gospel, where you said that as we come to appreciate how powerful the gospel is, the less we have to fear. You know, the more we appreciate the power of the gospel, the less we have to fear. But your book brings out some interesting polarities: the polarity of hope and fear, the polarity of anger and love, and I think sets it into a context that that the one doesn't mean the other has gone away.
Wow.
I find it powerful that the more you, do you think it's true that the more you love the right things, the more angry you're going to get about the wrong things?
Wow. Oh my goodness. That's so well said. I wish I had thought to say it that way.
I read your book.
Dr.
That's
Latham.
the only reason I can say it, is because I read your book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yes, I mean, I think I quote James Baldwin in there. I mean, there's a popular part of the quote about, you know, being Black Americans, being a constant state of rage or anger. But he also has more to say about that in terms of how one deals with that anger. But I think you're right. It's like the more you know, the more you're like, wow. I'm reading I'm having read to me on Audible Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste. Mm-hmm. Now, I already had her book on The Warmth of Other Suns on the Great Migration, which is up there in my my top 5 books. It was amazing. And it's my family. You know, as I read that, it's like, that's my family. Well, now this caste system book is blowing me away. And so I'm sitting there listening to it, but I'm hearing stories of things that I didn't know, and she's making connections, I know. And so on the one hand, I'm in the car like angry all over again. But then I stop, because I think, well, what does the anger do, right? And then I have to think about that. But you're right, there are some polarities, because I think it's possible to, as Paul would say, to be angry and not sin. And to not let the sun go down in your anger means do something about it before it stays around and festers. So I think it's possible to have both of those things happen at the same time. Thank you for that observation.
Yeah. A question from the chat. David Jacobson references the work of Ibram Kendi. He has both the history of race in America and then the newer book, I think, How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yes, yes.
And what, if anything, would you want to put differently in the discussion of anti-racism? Of course, David's presuming that as good scholars, we've read everything but I'm sure you'll be fully up on it.
No, I wish I could. It's so much of my field that I don't want to talk about my deficiencies right now, but I do. but the Kendi's book, always somebody asked in the chat to put it in there, but I won't be able to type it fast enough. But this one, the first one, is called Stamped from the Beginning. Mm-hmm. And he does talk about a history of racist ideas in America. His second book is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And that one I had on Audible. So I was, but what's interesting is that in that second book, he talks about his parents being Christian and going to a InterVarsity's Urbana conference and listening to Tom Skinner. And I'm like, wow, that's like right close to my age group, because I was a little too young for that. But his parents are a little older than me, but that's a world that I knew. That's a world that I can understand and had been exposed to. And so he does kind of address things for Christians. Anyway, I would say I would not, I would argue in his first book, I'm right with him. I think when he talks about the history of racist ideas and Christianity, I mean, let's face it, was complicit in the mess that we're in now. But his second book, How to Be Anti-Racist, there's probably some quibbling over how we define racism, because most people have been, the sociologists have been defining racism in terms of what the dominant power structure can do for those who don't have power. So that would say that the minority person cannot be racist. He nuances that a bit to say, it depends. It depends on if that person has power, because some of us still might get to a position of power and then act out of that institution to reinforce an oppressive system. So in that sense, even a minority person can tap into and be complicit in a racist structure. So I hear that, and so I check myself too, because I work for a white institution. So I don't want to be part and parcel of policies that would be oppressive to anyone, because then I would be complicit in it, even though my own heart is not aligned that way.
Can I ask you to reflect on two metaphors? One that is clear and I got in the book. The other you mentioned at the end with one of your questions about dismantling hierarchies and also about being under authority. And that is hierarchy versus decentering. So dismantling a hierarchy, which is a kind of a vertical, and then the other question is decentering. Do you think one of those is a more helpful metaphor for, I'll admit, so here I am, a white person of power who would like to be an accomplice. You differentiate accomplice and ally, and I believe you came down on the side of an accomplice in the work. Do you think one of those, dismantling hierarchy versus decentering, is a better image to work with, or another? And is that a contextual thing?
Wow, that's good. Of course, I have an ethicist asking me these questions. I hadn't actually thought about. I think I'm preferring the decentering. I quickly put a question about hierarchy because that's the way we see our society is arranged that way in strata, like in the Greco-Roman world. But there's something about the centering that I think is really more apt for what I'm trying to talk about. It's like because even when you have a hierarchy, you can still work to the benefit of somebody in a different place. But the centering, it's like everything is focusing on that. So you serve this folk, even So I'd have to think about that a bit more. But I'm liking the distinction you're making. So for me, that the notion of kind of reestablishing who gets to make decisions and exercise power is really fundamentally what I'm talking about. So I think maybe that centering is good.
I'm going to keep going with questions, but it looks like we got another one in the chat. As a white person, what can I do? I'm moved to tears literally every time I see racial injustice and brutal killings. I've marched with BLM and support protests, but I don't feel like that makes a difference. I want to do more, but what?
Thank you. And that question comes a lot to me, and I feel a little hesitant to answer it because some of our actions will be contextual, and I'm not a sociologist, so I'll make that disclaimer. And I have a friend, I'll put a plug for his book, my friend Drew Hart. He wrote a book, Can I Get a Witness? And he talks about the role of Christian activism. Came out like a few days before mine from the same publisher, and he's a friend of mine. But so I guess what I'll say is part of our solution, whatever it is, whatever the actions are, is to always find yourself in a place where you are getting your cues from the folks who are experiencing the marginalization. So yes, you could ask me what I should do, and I could probably answer the question from my own particular place. But you want to ask that question of your neighbors, of the people who are with you. So when you have true allies or accomplices, I like that better because accomplice goes down with you when there's any problem, right? The ally says, I'm with you in spirit. Right? The accomplice is like, y'all both going down. But anyway, but the thing is, in your world, you may have neighbors, you may have friends, you may have, pastors down the street, you might, whatever, your kids' parents of your kids' friends and all that, you need to figure out how they are processing things, and then genuine friendships can emerge where you can find those things out. I'm not asking you to just get a white friend, a black friend, or Asian friend to get information and pump them for information. This has happened too much in our society where,
right. Shifts the labor, right?
It shifts the labor,
it's
right?
back, yeah.
I'm saying when you do your homework, it's by getting in a situation where you are receiving the reality that people are sharing with you, and then you can figure out what your actions are. So I don't want to make it too easy, because protests are good, and sometimes it's not just the protest. Sometimes it's working in a different place, but that'll again depend on context and the folks that you are ministering among.
Mm-hmm. A polarity that I thought of is a polarity between hope and fear. Your book says that the people who are suffering are the ones that can teach us to hope, but you also bring out some things about fear. Yesterday, I heard Erica Bridgeford, who is the founder of Ceasefire in Baltimore, the Baltimore Ceasefire Movement. And she has this interesting story of how she felt called to start Baltimore Ceasefire and resisted the call for a couple of years out of fear that it wouldn't succeed, that they would do a ceasefire weekend and somebody would be murdered. And it was remarkable to hear how in a sense it's hope and love that pulled her beyond that fear.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's a fear that like we talked about in that diaspora vulnerability place, but fears get confronted, or at least they should be or can be. And I think the thing I'm trying to say is that while we have fear in our marginalization, what we're learning are the ways that people in that place conquered, or maybe they didn't conquer, but confronted those fears and pressed on, and their faith enabled them to press on. So, and that's a message I want to give to younger people. I've been seeing younger African Americans particularly get disinterested in Christianity because of what they're seeing in the media, what they see in white church. And I want to say, yeah, white people can be afraid of us, but there is a way that and we can be afraid of what they can do to us, but there's a way that we can confront our fears through faith that I try to elaborate upon in the book. Thank you.
A curator question from Jason Poling. Did your own experience, because you taught in the EI for about a decade, did you find that the EI classroom could be a place where the anti-racism work of whites listening to persons of color can happen? And that's a really risky question for a dean to ask. Is this a place where some of that decentering can go on and does go on, or is that a growing edge for us?
Well, I'll be fair. I haven't been regular at the EI for several years now, right? I mean, I left in, I guess, around
I've been
12.
here 8 years. You haven't been here for 8 years, my friend.
Right, 8 years. That's right. 8 years. And I would say that like the folks who logged on today, there's a fair amount of folks that I found at the EI who want to, and that's why they come to the EI, put themselves in a place to learn from a diversity of people. So that's the fair part, I'll say, and I mean that very sincerely. I feel like the very few people that I had in a class, maybe early on, like a BS 600 class, who did not feel that, didn't come back. That wasn't their cup of tea. But those who wanted to engage are the strength of the EI, I feel, right? So I don't know if there was a forum for it, right? I don't know if there was a forum. So maybe there can be those kinds of places that I'm saying this. It's like a caucus, right, where African American students can have a conversation and be able to curate their ideas and concerns and thoughts and share those with the broader community, and not be seen as subversive. Because when those things happen, I feel like I've seen it happen where people think, "Oh, what are they doing? What are they conspiring against?" And that's a whole nother issue. But the point is, those kind of spaces I think can happen. But there's always challenges with the notion of community and at the EI, where everybody's got a busy life. But I do think the EI is set up well for it, because we are, at the EI, I remember, is very much about the relationships and about welcoming people from from very broad and different backgrounds.
One maybe final question, looking at the time, we might have time for a couple of more in the chat. How can we accelerate equal access to both economic and educational resources and power?
Yeah, that's a bigger societal question that I wish I had more like political acumen to answer. But I do think that
can I put in a plug that you have a great chapter on voting and how and the way that does and doesn't relate. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. No, that's good. Thank you. I do mention that because I'm thinking
Yeah.
of like the things that I can engage in on my level.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the folks who are like really good community activists can answer that better. So I'm making my disclaimers along the way. But I do think that, I mean, voting is one of like the low level thing. And I find myself very frustrated when people don't engage on that level. And I feel like it's an act of privilege to say, well, I just don't want, I'm just not going to vote. I mean, people die so we could vote, right? And so I do think that there's an opportunity for us to engage at least on that level. But a lot of what I'm saying, I think that relates to political and economic world is that there's, from a Christian standpoint, I'm not a political theorist, but from a Christian standpoint, there has got to be a sense of equity that's working in us. I mean, Paul even says in the sense of giving, right? In 2 Corinthians, when he's talking about giving the collection, he says that I want there to be equity. He uses that word equity, and that freaks out a lot of Christians. It sounds socialist. He says, that's what I want. I want there to be fairness. Nobody should be unnecessarily burdened. And his whole body metaphor, where the weaker members of the body are to be treated with greater honor, his whole body metaphor is saying that we should not, as Christians, be anywhere accepting of this kind of a marginalization, right, economically or such. So the resources, I mean, these are all questions that they say all politics is local. Some of this has got to happen on a local level, that we are paying attention to how our schools operate, how our community doles out resources, and even complying with the census. I think that we want to find out like how those are important things to be able to say how do resources get distributed. I'm gonna answer one question that I saw pop up.
Yep.
About the book, about D'Angelo's book, White Fragility. Somebody mentioned, oh, I see, it was given to me privately.
Sorry, I missed it.
That's all right, I see, it was given to me privately.
Okay.
I'll go real quickly. But yeah, it's gotten criticized by Black people recently because in one sense, a lot of white people were reading that book and not reading Black folks who have talked about race and such.
Right.
I think the reason why I actually pulled it in is because it was so appropriate to a situation where I was working in a church that was majority white. So I simply used the book to help me and to help my readers see how even in this kind of white, somewhat progressive world, there was still something that a white scholar could recognize and call out. So in that sense, I wanted it to be a white person speaking to white people. And so it was a very purposeful sense of calling her to witness to that. But but her theories, I don't think are really a problem. I mean, the folks who are criticizing, I don't think are criticizing the sense that the basic thesis, which is that it's hard for whatever reason, you can define hard, but it's hard for a lot of white people to accept the notion of systemic racism and injustice in our society. And I fundamentally agree with that.
There's a trope that went around for a while that says when African Americans get killed, white people start a book club. And I think some of the criticism of her book may be partly related to that.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
We've got, I mean, that was the first thing I started doing was buying books, and that's certainly not sufficient.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions we'll leave hanging because of time, but we can say that if you study with biblical faculty at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute, you can be involved in recognizing the problems of historical misinterpretations like the Curse of Ham. And the question from regarding Howard Thurman, Dr. Hunt is actually teaching a course this semester on spiritualities of liberation and hope, and I know that Thurman's one of the people they're their
Oh,
reading.
awesome. Awesome.
But it's a great question from Isaiah Red that I hope folks can take with them and continue to answer in their lives as well as their thinking, and that is how to foster authentic solidarity in a
Yeah.
demographic of
Deceptiveness.
deceptiveness.
Yeah, I should be clear. When I was talking, that demographic of deceptiveness, I had to take a screenshot. I like that phrasing there. So, but I guess I wanted to make clear, I'm talking about a solidarity among the marginalized. I'm actually not calling on white folks to
Right.
necessarily get it, but some will,
Mm-hmm.
because if the folks on the margins are together and we can be better united. I mean, this is the way it happened actually in the civil rights movement. You had Jewish people marching alongside African American. I mean, there was a certain sense of solidarity
Right.
that I think some of that is coming back a little bit in the. I mean, there were a whole bunch of Asian Christians out here in Chicago marching for Black Lives Matter, and Asian Christian collective that wanted to collaborate. I'm seeing those kinds of things. That's what I'm talking about. Folks who've been marginalized coming together. Yeah.
Thank you.